And good afternoon, Bombers fans. This is episode 5 of the True Blue podcast here on G Show Productions. I'm your host, Graham, the G Show Forsyth. Special thanks to our sponsors, first off, for sponsoring this edition of the show. And Mid-Canada Fasteners and Tools, use Bombers Pod, the promo code, today when you visit stores in Brandon and Winnipeg for Mid-Canada Fasteners and Tools, to receive 5% off all tools and 10% off all accessories and hardware when you visit them in stores until the end of October. Visit their website as well, makecanonfasteners.shop, to learn more about the great products that the one-stop shop for all your industrial needs has to offer. We're also brought to you by Terraco, serving Manitoba producers for over 80 years. Visit their website at terraco.ca to learn more about them today, as well as Goaltenders, your goalie's personal video review service. Visit their website at gordytumelsongoalies.ca to see what all the fuss is about in terms of them doing goaltending coaching differently. Gordy Tumelson doing the solo in the solo practice, of course. But yeah, in today's edition of the True Blue podcast, I know it's been a while since I've been here to do one of these episodes, but I'm going to talk about the Bombers clinching the West for the third straight season at this point, what the Bombers should be focusing on heading into the playoffs in the last 2 weeks, heading into that first round bye. Dalton Schoen, an injury update on him, as well as the other players on the injury list ahead of the game against Edmonton today. I'm also going to be talking about the MOP conversation, who I think should be in it for the Blue Bombers, as well as giving my prediction and my thoughts ahead of the Bombers' Week 20 matchup against Edmonton. That's coming up on this week's edition of the True Blue podcast, The Return, here on G Show Productions. And starting off with the biggest news for the Blue and Gold after the 41-16 win that Calgary had yesterday over the BC Lions, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers clinched first place in the West for the third straight season. The performance by Calgary was huge yesterday. Domination, 41-16 against the second best team in the West at this point, and I think it's huge for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Huge to get that week of rest. It's always nice come playoff time, even though the Bombers are coming off a bye heading into this week with 2 weeks to go left in the season. Playing in front of the home crowd, it seems like the Bombers are able to feed off of the energy of arguably, if not the best fans in the CFL, and they just play better at home overall. They've been near perfect this season in terms of the record at 7-1. They average 34.8 points per game at home this season on offense. They allow 18 points per game against on defense at home, comparing that to their road record where the Bombers, their points for a bit lower at 29, and the defense gives up a bit more points against per game at 24 points against per game. The Bombers, in many ways, they earned this bye at home, even though they got that help from Calgary. With that win yesterday, I think that the Bombers were going to lock it up today, because I do think that they go out and beat Edmonton. I'll have more of my predictions on that game coming up later in this show. But compared to the Bombers playing on the road, compared to them playing at home, this is the best case scenario for them heading into the playoffs. With how tighter the West has truly been this season, BC has dominated the Bombers once. Bombers have dominated them once, and of course, that game a few weeks ago now was an absolute shootout and could have gone any way. Of course, a team like Calgary is playing better as the season comes to an end, playing for their playoff lives. If they end up upsetting in the first round of the West playoffs, who knows what they could do coming into Winnipeg. But, Winnipeg has the best overall team in the West. We've seen it all season long. They have the most points for in the West this season at 513. They have the best defense in the conference when it comes down to points allowed in 339 in total. Sucks that Dalton Schoen is most likely going to be out for the rest of the season, but the Bombers got so many weapons on the offensive side of the ball. Brady Oliveira has been outstanding this season. The defense has come up huge when they need to be. The real concerns for this Bombers team is Zach Collaros turning over the football the way he's done this season, and the special teams. But talking about Zach Collaros, I feel pretty comfortable with him in big moments still as a Bombers fan, because he's shown he can do it before in his time here, being able to be the quarterback leading this team to 2 straight Grey Cups. So the Bombers being at home this season, with all things considering, they are way better at home than they are on the road. 7-1 compared to 5-3, and getting this first round bye is huge to get that extra week of rest heading into the playoffs. In terms of what I think the Bombers should focus on in these last 2 weeks, just stay healthy. I think that it's going to be important to, of course, play your starters in these last 2 weeks coming up, but I wouldn't be surprised if Michael O'Shea ends up going to his second stringers and even maybe some third stringers at times in these last 2 games. Of course, that game next week is going to be bigger for Calgary, depending on what happens with Saskatchewan losing this week. Calgary could very well clinch coming up, depending on what happens in that game later on against the Argos and the Riders. But Calgary's going to come in hungry. I really don't care if the Bombers personally lose next week or this week. I just hope that they continue to build on some good habits. I think that working on getting a fast start coming out is going to be so huge for their success come playoff time. Managing the ball, working on the things on special teams in terms of getting better and better there as the last 2 weeks of the season come along. So I think that's what the Bombers should be focusing on. You got to stay healthy, though, heading into the playoffs, because the West is not going to be a cakewalk. Vernon Adams Jr. is probably going to be back to play in the playoffs. He hasn't been playing the past few weeks from what I know. From what I've seen, he didn't get a chance to play yesterday. Dane Evans was playing for the BC Lions. Obviously, Vernon Adams Jr. going out with injury late in that game 2 weeks ago against the Hamilton Tiger Cats at this point. But I think for this Winnipeg Blue Bombers team, you got to have all your top guns healthy, and you got to continue to focus on those good habits heading into your final bye week of the season, which is going to be that first round in the West playoffs, in that West semifinal, as it's going to be BC going up against either the Calgary Stampeders and the Saskatchewan Roughriders. But coming up after this first transition in this edition of the True Blue podcast, I'm going to be updating you all on Dalton Schoen and the rest of the injuries this Bombers team has heading into the Week 20 matchup against the Edmonton Elks. You're watching the True Blue podcast here on G Show Productions, brought to you by Mid-Canada Fasteners and Tools, Terrico, as well as Goaltenders. Welcome back to this edition of the True Blue podcast here on G Show Productions. It's going to be a shorter one this week, folks. Bringing it a day later because I had some stuff going on last night that I needed to take care of. True Blue episode 6 will be coming out next week, airing on Friday night here on G Show Productions. We'll also have a Manitoba Major Junior Hockey League game that we will be covering that night and recording, looking to go live for that one on either our YouTube channel or Vimeo OTT, the service we'll be using for then. But stay tuned for that. On our social media pages, by the way, we got a Facebook page made it yesterday. Going to make a Winnipeg Blue Bombers fan page for all you fans to come in there and discuss all the things happening around your favorite team. It's going to probably be called the True Blue Fan Group, naming it after this podcast. But yeah, let's get into it. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers, their injury report. Yeah, if you take a look here, this is heading into this week's game. Dalton Schoen has not participated at all this week in practice and has been ruled out for the Week 20 matchup against Edmonton. There's word that Dalton Schoen is very well out for the season at this point, so that's a blow to the Bombers' receiving corps. Not having him in, where he's led the Bombers in yards, receptions, targets, and TDs this year, being Zach Collaros' favorite target and the one he relies on the most compared to the Bombers receivers. Demarion Houston, Brandon Alexander, and Shane Gauthier, all full practice participants on Wednesday and Thursday, but they're all questionable for this game, as well as Jackson Jeffcoat. He didn't participate on Tuesday, dealing with that nagging hip injury, but was a full participant in Wednesday and Thursday's practice. He's questionable for today. And yeah, I mean, starting with, those guys outside of Schoen, first off, when we talk about guys like Houston, Alexander, Gauthier, and Jeffcoat, I wouldn't mind if these guys would sit out for the last 2 weeks of the season, keep them healthy, because a guy like Houston, we know how big time he is for this Bombers defense in that secondary, and we know how big time Jackson Jeffcoat is for how this Bombers team is able to get pressure with the D-line. He adds so much energy to it and allows for pieces like Willie Jefferson to be that much more lethal, and for him to have some more freedom to do the good things that he does in terms of getting to the passer and knocking down balls like that. Jackson Jeffcoat is just such a game changer when you put him into the lineup, because you add that much more skill and you add that extra disturber in the rushing game of the Bombers, their pass rush, that is, as well as their running rush, I don't know if that's the right terminology or not, but I hope that, they manage him well. Heading into the playoffs, they've done it pretty well this season, holding him out of some games to have him ready to go for the next, and that's made a huge difference. So, yeah, I think that, the biggest thing is obviously Dalton Schoen not being in the lineup, probably for the rest of the season, including the playoffs for the Bombers, no matter how far they take it. Him and Collaros have so much trust in each other, and like I mentioned, he's been the leading receiver on this Bombers receiving core this year. But the good news for the Bombers is they have one of, if not the most complete receiving corps in the league. Dembski is still in the lineup and healthy. Kenny Lawler, since he started playing late into the season, later than usual for guys obviously dealing with getting a work visa, he's been big time for this Bombers team and such a big play receiver. So you also look at guys like Drew Wolotarski, who has been Mr. Reliable once again, and Collaros has even found him for some deep plays. Rasheed Bailey's going to get more reps, and we've seen him step up in the past, and Oliveira's been implemented more into the passing game, as good as he's been in the run game to this season, which he's been phenomenal, the best RB in the league. He's also proved his versatility and been a reliable pass catcher for Zach Collaros. It's up to Collaros to trust his guys, and I feel like he will. As much as Zach Collaros has struggled, I don't think, honestly, and I'm going to say it now, I've called him the best QB in the league pretty much all year long on this podcast, but you can't simply do that right now because of his inconsistencies. But Zach Collaros can still be that guy, I think, and he showed it late in that game against the BC Lions in that big comeback win that the Bombers did end up having. I think more of that was on Oliveira really stepping up his game and proving why he's been the best most consistent player in this Bombers offense so far this year. But Collaros, he's going to trust his guys, I think, when you talk about guys like Nick Dembski and Kenny Lawler. We've seen them all season long hitting those guys for big shots down the field. Dalton Schoen, even though he's become the staple in terms of this receiving game, guys like Dembski and Lawler can play. Wolotarski is a terrific safety blanket for this offense, and Rasheed Bailey is a guy that has a lot of underrated skill, I think, and the more you use Oliveira, the better, in my opinion. So as big of a loss that is for the Bombers receiving core, losing a top 3 receiver in the CFL this year and their best receiver on their team by the stats, I think that the Bombers are so deep at that position, at the receiving core group, that this team should be all right come playoff time. But it does suck not having Schoen in there, because you do lose some of that firepower that you're accustomed to having and have had this season. But yeah, in terms of the MOP conversation, there's been a lot of talk about Vernon Adams Jr. and Collaros being the 2 guys that are going to be nominated from the West, but I think, honestly, it should be Brady Oliveira. And yes, the Lions have struggled without Adams in the lineup. Yes, he leads the league in passing yards. He's second in TDs, but I don't really think there's been a clear-cut best QB in the league this season. I mean, sure, you could say it is Adams, but he's had some turnover problems. As good as he is and as great of an athlete he is, there's been those times where, especially in that game against Winnipeg, where that offense couldn't really get things going in the second half. I think the best offense in the West has been the Bombers. You can make an argument when they're on the top of their game that they're the best offense in the league, and it started with Brady Oliveira. He's been the staple of this Bombers offense this season. He leads the league in rushing yards. He's proven his versatility, and he's stepped up in those big moments when Zach Collaros necessarily hasn't. Or hasn't necessarily been able to step up, as I should say. Yes, there's been fumbles from Oliveira. He's second in terms of RBs and fumbles lost and 4, but you take a look in Collaros and Vernon Adams Jr., they're both top 2 in the interceptions categories. In fact, Vernon Adams Jr. leads the league in interceptions, and there hasn't been like a clear-cut, this QB is by far the best in the CFL this season. Same with the receivers. I mean, there's so many good receivers in the CFL, but I could say that one is as good or better than the other compared to when you look at the RBs, where Oliveira has been the clear-cut best RB, who, is going to be 2,000 yard all-purpose type of player this season, a guy who has become more valuable to the Blue Bombers' success as this season has gone along in terms of settling down how that offense plays and breaking through for big gains and clutch gains at that. I just feel like we haven't really seen as dominant as an RB season as Oliveira has had since guys like John Cornish, or even since, in terms of Winnipeg standards, since Andrew Harris was here, and you could argue that Oliveira has been even more impressive this season. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Vernon Adams Jr. does end up getting the nomination for MOP this year, because it's kind of turned into more of a QB award. But Brady Oliveira, his value to this Bombers offense this season, as stacked as they are at the receiving game and as good as Collaros can be, Oliveira has been more consistent throughout this season. He's been able to take on a big workload and deliver. He's rushed the ball 238 times and averaged 6 yards per carries. He's been a game changer for this Bombers team, and like I said, become more versatile and is doing so many good things in so many different ways. So I think if there's any year where a skill player should be nominated for this award, like Eugene Lewis last season, who just had a ridiculous season for the West this time around, I do truly believe it should be Oliveira, because, Zach Collaros, with his turnovers, has hurt this Bombers team more than he's helped them. They've just had such a good team that they can overcome it. And in terms of the offensive side of the ball, when Oliveira starts getting the ball more, you could see the life kind of start to open up for this Bombers team. And they do end up getting more life from giving Brady Oliveira the ball. But yeah, that's my argument for the MOP, who I think it should be. People probably think it's a bit biased since I am a Bombers fan and this is a Bombers podcast. Adams Jr. has been great this season. It's just I think Oliveira deserves more of the nod, in my opinion, in terms of when it comes to the MOP conversation this year, for the West at least. But we shall see what happens, as I'm pretty sure the ballots are due pretty soon. They might have been due yesterday. I'm not too sure. I saw something on Twitter about that. Derek Taylor, I think, tweeted it out. But yeah, we are going to be back here, or I'm going to be back here for the final part of this shorter episode of the True Blue podcast, the official Winnipeg Blue Bombers podcast, here on G Show Productions, to talk about their upcoming game in almost an hour and 30 minutes away against the Edmonton Elks at IG Field tonight. This podcast, of course, brought to you by Make Canada Fasteners and Tools. Use Bombers Pod, the promo code, until the end of October to save 5%, or to get a 5% discount on all tools when you enter into their stores, as well as a 10% discount on accessories and hardware when using Bombers Pod when visiting Make Canada Fasteners and Tools in stores. Of course, also brought to you by Terrico and Goaltenders. And I'll be back in just a moment here for the final part of True Blue, Episode 5, here on G Show Productions YouTube channel. Stick around. Welcome back to the True Blue podcast here on G Show Productions, brought to you by Goaltenders, Terrico, and Make Canada Fasteners and Tools. Visit their store locations in Brandon and Winnipeg today and use Bombers Pod, this promo code, until the end of October, as this month is coming to an end very soon, to get 5% off all tools and 5% and 10% off accessories and hardware when using the Bombers Pod promo code, visiting Make Canada Fasteners and Tools in Brandon and Winnipeg. But yeah, welcome back, everybody. The Bombers set to kick off at IG Field for their final home game of the regular season before heading to Calgary next week to finish their season off at McMahon Stadium. An update on the scores right now. Of course, last night, Calgary with a huge win, 41-16 over the BC Lions. BC falling to 12-6 in their last regular season game of the year. They'll have the bye next week, and Calgary staying alive for that final playoff spot at 6-11 now. They need some help, though, from the Toronto Argonauts, as they are facing off against the Saskatchewan Roughriders right now. The Roughriders, it's their last game of the regular season, so if they lose, they are done, if I understand things correctly from what I've read. Saskatchewan, though, they are up 17-16 to start things off. Dolegala is getting the start. It's 17-16 for the Rough Riders at halftime. They led after the first quarter. Toronto put up 9 points in the second quarter. Saskatchewan put up 7. Good enough to have them in the lead with 30 minutes left in the game. So, yeah, going to be interesting to see what happens there. Toronto has 2 games left in the season. They're at 14-2 right now. So if they win 2 in a row, they could go 16-2, which would be absolutely ridiculous to end off the very successful year that they've had. But for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, they will be at home, as I said, to take on the Edmonton Elks. Edmonton comes into this Week 20 matchup with a 4-13 record. They are also playing in their last regular season game of the year, so you'd have to think that Edmonton looking to make a statement with Trey Ford leading the way against the Blue Bombers today. And we'll get to the keys to the game, brought to you by one of our three sponsors, any of them that could be. I'll probably come up with a sponsor for this segment coming up for next week's podcast episode. But I think for the Bombers, I was talking about building good habits. And one of those good habits has to be starting fast. That hasn't necessarily happened consistently for the Bombers this season. And when they do start fast, they got such a great team that they're able to lock things down more, settle into the game more, be comfortable, and be able to control the game. I think that's when the Bombers are at their best, when they're able to control the game, especially on offense with how Brady Oliveira has been running this season. I think, though, one thing that comes with starting fast is once you have the lead, you got to take care of the football and also stay disciplined. The Bombers have been very disciplined as this season has progressed. But taking care of the football has kind of been an issue for this team, especially, on the offensive side of the ball. Collaros, if this team is going to win a Grey Cup, and I have faith in him if this team even gets to the Grey Cup at the very least, which would be a fourth straight year, which would be incredible. He has to take care of the football. He didn't do the greatest job against BC in that Week 18 matchup, but got it done when it mattered the most. I think that this is a perfect time to take advantage of a weaker Edmonton team to build confidence there in terms of taking care of the football for Zach Collaros especially. I think containing Trey Ford is going to be huge for this defensive line and this defense in general, but more so the defensive line because it starts with them. I think that they do have the capability to do it, but if Trey Ford can, do the things he can do with his feet, make the athletic plays he can make, that's when he's at his best. So if you can limit more of that, force him to be more contained in the pocket, you're not going to be able to do that all game with how good of an athlete and player that he is. But if you can do that enough, you can make him a bit frustrated, give your guys better time to cover if, he holds on to the ball longer. And I think that would bode well for the Blue and Gold. And I think special teams, in terms of building good habits, they need to build good habits for sure heading into the playoffs, and it starts with this game. In terms of Castillo, focusing on making that one PAT, and then the next one. This team, if they do end up missing a field goal, being good in their tackles and getting the return game going, I think is going to be huge for the Bombers if they are going to have success heading into the playoffs, and once that West Final comes on November 11th on Remembrance Day. So, yeah, I think that, special teams, it is crucial in this league like any football league, but especially the CFL. And the Bombers, they've had their problems in the return game this season, as well as sometimes in their coverage when they miss a kick, or in terms of punt returns and kick returns. Build that confidence heading into the playoffs, and I think that starts today against the Edmonton Elks. In terms of the odds for this game, taking a look at it, I don't see any on the Score app, which is pretty lame, but the Bombers, when they last played Edmonton, and they didn't even play that well, won 38-29. So with the Bombers averaging 34 points per game at home this season, allowing about 18 points against per game at home this season, I'm going to go with the Blue Bombers to win this one tonight, 37-16. I think that the defense is going to come to play. I think Collaros is going to have a really solid game too, and I think that you give the rock to Oliveira, good things are going to happen. Come out fast. I think the Bombers will get off to a fast start in today's game, and I think that once they do have that lead, they'll control this ball game and really put a stamp on why they are the best team in the West heading into the second last week of the regular season. But with my prediction history, it could very well be a close game. The Bombers look like crap and they come out flat. So we shall see. But yeah, that's going to just about do it for this edition of the True Blue Podcast for episode 5 here on G Show Productions. Coming up after this final transition, I'll be back with you all for some final words here on this Saturday. An hour and a half, just under an hour and a half away from the Bombers kicking off against the Edmonton Elks at IG Field. Well, you made it to the end of this week's edition of the True Blue Podcast. Great to be back, and for anyone that watched it, thank you for tuning in. I've been your host, Graham, the G Show Forsyth. Went solo this week, going to have guests for next week's edition of the True Blue Podcast, so stay tuned for that. We do have a Facebook page now. We're going to start uploading content there. Going to make a True Blue fan page there for this podcast for Bombers fans to discuss all things Winnipeg Blue Bombers. There's going to be some trivia in there, some news discussions, just some topics of discussions in general. So it should be a lot of fun. Our handle to our Facebook page is down below in the description of this episode, so be sure to check it out. Next week, we'll be heading into the final week of the regular season for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Just taking a look at when they play. They are playing on Friday night at 8 p.m. Central Time, so might release the podcast a bit earlier, so stay tuned for that on our social media, our Facebook page, and all of the others. Also, be sure to check out our website, gshow.ca. We'll be posting a Winnipeg Blue Bombers blog, probably on Brady Oliveira for Monday, so stay tuned for that for Volume 3 of our blog called Sports in the Prairies, a Manitoba sports blog by yours truly, Graham, the G Show Forsyth. But yeah, excited for what next week has to offer. Can't wait for it. I want to thank my sponsors of today's episode once again for supporting us here at G Show Productions and Make Hand Fasteners and Tools, Terrico, as well as goaltenders. Be sure, like I've already said, to use the Bombers pod promo until the end of October when visiting Make Hand Fasteners and Tools stores to get 5% off all tools and 10% off all accessories and hardware when visiting one of their stores in either Brandon or Winnipeg, Manitoba. So stay tuned for the upcoming guest list and when the podcast comes out next week. We'll be posting earlier on in the week on our social media to have all that information for you guys, so you won't want to miss it coming up next week for episode 6 of the True Blue Podcast. I've been your host, Graham, the G Show Forsyth, giving you the salute, peacing out, and saying so long, everybody. Enjoy the game today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next Friday. Time TBD at this point. See you, everybody. Take care.